When you close your eyes and imagine the Colosseum, what do you see? Most people picture an ancient arena, weathered by time, where brave warriors once fought for glory and death. The textbooks tell us it was built for entertainment, a monument to Roman engineering, a symbol of the empire's power. But this image, this comfortable, almost romantic vision, is a carefully constructed lie that has been passed down through centuries of scholarship. Beneath the sand of the Colosseum lies something far more disturbing than blood or lions. There exists a secret that historians have spent generations either missing or deliberately obscuring. The Colosseum was not primarily a venue for spectacle at all. It was something far more calculated, far more deliberate. It was a machine. Not a machine of metal and gears, but one of stone and psychology, designed with meticulous precision to control the minds and bodies of 50,000 people simultaneously. Consider the structure itself. The Colosseum's architecture wasn't accidental. Every arch, every passage, every staircase was engineered to move crowds in specific directions, to create certain sensations, to manipulate how people experience their own presence within the space. The sight lines were perfected, so that no matter where you sat, you felt implicated in what happened below. You couldn't look away. The sound bounced through the structure in ways that amplified screams and crowd noise into something overwhelming and almost hypnotic. This wasn't just impressive engineering. This was psychological architecture. But the real horror lies beneath your feet. Underground, hidden from the crowds above, exists a labyrinth of chambers and tunnels known as the hypogeum. What recent archaeology has revealed about this space challenges everything we think we know about the arena. Trap doors that could open without warning. Mechanical elevators that lifted entire platforms with animals or condemned prisoners into the arena floor. Cages where hundreds of exotic beasts waited in darkness. A tunnel system so vast that it connected directly to gladiator barracks miles away through underground passages. This wasn't just infrastructure. This was a calculated system to manipulate perception and control narrative. The Romans understood something that modern propaganda experts would later spend decades trying to figure out. They grasped, with disturbing clarity, that if you controlled the environment, the sounds, the sights, the physical space itself, you could make large groups of people feel specific emotions at specific moments. You could create mass hysteria on demand. You could make fear and awe and excitement wash over thousands of people simultaneously, like a synchronized wave of emotion you could trigger whenever you chose. The Colosseum was perhaps the first true instrument of this kind in human history. What's most remarkable is that we have ancient accounts describing all of this. Roman writers documented the mechanical systems, the underground chambers, the ways that spectacles were orchestrated. Yet somewhere along the line, these accounts were treated as mere curiosities. The full significance was downplayed. Modern historians read the same primary sources we're reading now, but they discussed them with the tone of people describing impressive engineering rather than people describing a weapon of mass psychological manipulation. The Colosseum wasn't just a place where Romans went to watch death. It was designed to be a place where Romans went to feel power, to feel unified, to feel controlled, to surrender their individual consciousness to something larger and more frightening than themselves. The Colosseum didn't simply appear. It was built deliberately, at a specific moment in Roman history, for reasons that had nothing to do with the surface justifications we're taught. The story of its construction is one of manipulation disguised as generosity, of power disguised as gift. In the year 72 CE, Emperor Vespasian made an unusual decision. He chose to construct a massive amphitheatre on the grounds of the hated Golden House, the Domus Aurea, a palatial compound that had once belonged to the despised Emperor Nero. To the Roman people, this gesture appeared magnanimous. The emperor was reclaiming what had been private and making it public. He was returning to the people what a tyrant had stolen. It was perfect politics. The crowds cheered. The story was told and retold. Vespasian the restorer, Vespasian the generous, Vespasian the friend of Rome. But look deeper, and a different narrative emerges. Rome in 72 CE was a state in crisis. A year earlier, the Jewish rebellion in Judea had been brutally suppressed, but the moral consequences rippled through the empire. The population was growing restless. People were beginning to ask difficult questions about authority, about power, about whether the endless expansion and conquest actually served the ordinary citizen. There was unease, a growing sense that something was wrong with how the empire operated. Vespasian understood what all powerful leaders eventually learn, that you cannot silence dissent through force alone. You must distract. You must redirect attention. You must give people something so consuming, so overwhelming, so entertaining that they forget to ask uncomfortable questions about governance and justice. The Colosseum became that distraction. And it worked so perfectly that we've been distracted for 2,000 years. The construction was financed through taxation and forced labor. Slaves by the thousands worked and died building this monument. The money came from conquered territories, extracted as tribute from people who had no choice but to contribute. And when the structure was finally complete, the same machinery of oppression that built it would be used to feed it a literal and symbolic pipeline, converting human suffering into spectacle. Yet what's most insidious is how the narrative was reframed. They didn't build it to celebrate Rome. They built it to make Rome forget what Rome was becoming. They built it to replace actual political discourse with visceral, consuming entertainment. They built it to teach the population that surrender to spectacle was preferable to participation in governance. The Romans themselves documented this. Official records describe how often games were held, how many people attended, how much money was spent. But these records were written with a tone of normalcy, as if describing routine city operations rather than describing something darker. What we're looking at is an early version of mechanisms we see operating in every complex society since. The use of spectacular entertainment to pacify populations, the deliberate creation of distraction from institutional violence and inequality, the weaponization of spectacle, not as mere entertainment, but as a tool of control. And once this machine was complete, once this psychological apparatus was in place, Rome needed something essential to make it function. Rome needed victims. A machine requires fuel. The Colosseum required people. And Rome, with characteristic efficiency, developed an entire system to manufacture that supply. The ludus, the gladiator schools, were not training facilities in any modern sense. They were something closer to death factories. Massive complexes where men were systematically transformed into commodities, where trainers and lanistas, wealthy patrons who functioned as both businessmen and masters, owned human beings the same way someone might own cattle. These weren't necessarily cruel men by Roman standards. They were simply businessmen operating within a system. The system itself was the horror. The supply chain was complex and vast. Rome initially filled the arenas with prisoners of war. Thousands of men defeated in conquest and dragged to Rome were given the choice: execution or the arena. Most chose the arena, not realizing they were choosing a slower, more painful version of the same thing. When the supply of prisoners of war dwindled, Rome looked elsewhere. Criminals were sentenced to arena death as punishment. Then the poor and desperate began selling themselves, literally auctioning their bodies to lanistas in exchange for money and the faint possibility of fame. And then, gradually, Rome began a systematic trade in exotic animals. Thousands of beasts captured from Africa, India, and beyond, transported across vast distances, many dying en route, all eventually destined to die in the arena. What's shocking is the scale. The Colosseum didn't host games occasionally. It hosted them constantly, nearly year-round. This wasn't occasional entertainment. This was industrial-scale death, as routinized and normalized as any factory operation. The Romans documented it. They kept records. They knew exactly what was happening. They knew how many animals had been captured, how many men had died, how much money had been spent. This knowledge wasn't hidden. It was written down, discussed, recorded as a matter of normal business. Yet modern scholarship has consistently downplayed the significance of these records. Historians read the same accounts we're reading now. Documents explicitly describing how many thousands of animals were slaughtered annually, how prisoners were systematically executed through arena combat, how the entire operation was funded and maintained like any other state institution, and they described it as cultural practice, as if calling something cultural somehow neutralizes its violence, as if understanding something historically makes it less horrifying. The truth is that the machinery was deliberate, vast, and absolutely foundational to how Rome maintained its power. It wasn't peripheral. It wasn't an odd cultural quirk. It was central. The profits from the arena went somewhere. The spectacle served purposes. The system had logic. And that logic was about transforming human suffering into a tool of control. But a machine requires not just fuel but operators. Not just victims but witnesses. And those witnesses, the crowds, the populations who came to watch, they had stories too. Stories that Rome tried very hard to erase. Every culture creates stories about its heroes. Rome was no exception. The legendary fighters, the ones whose names survived through time, became almost mythological. Flamma, who won so many times that he was offered retirement and refused. Spiculus, whose skill was so breathtaking that emperors attended games specifically to watch him fight. Priscus and Verus, whose legendary duel ended in such perfect balance that both were granted their lives. These men became celebrities in a way that almost transcends description. They were recognized in the streets. Women threw themselves at them. The wealthy offered them money and property. They had power that few ordinary men could ever imagine. But this is where the mythology becomes dangerous, because when we focus on the famous, we become blind to everyone else. And the truth is far darker than any story of glory ever told. The vast majority of gladiators were not volunteers seeking fame. They were men with no other choice. Prisoners of war dragged to Rome after their cities were conquered, given an ultimatum: face execution or face the arena. The choice was an illusion, of course. Both paths led to the same place. Criminals condemned to death, murderers, thieves, rebels against Roman law, were offered the arena as an alternative to the noose or the sword. Most took it, not understanding that they were simply choosing a slower, more public version of the same ending. Then there were the desperate. The poor who had sold everything and had nothing left but their bodies. Men so broken by slavery or poverty that auctioning themselves to a lanista seemed like an escape. These men signed contracts, actual legal documents, detailing what would happen to them, how they would be trained, how they would fight, and most importantly, what would happen if they lost. Many of these contracts explicitly stated that the fighter accepted the possibility of death. But here's what the records reveal. Many of these men did not actually understand the odds. They were not told that most gladiators died within 5 years. They were not told that certain types of gladiators, certain body types assigned to certain fighting styles, had much higher mortality rates than others. They were not told the full truth. Demographic evidence shows that the average gladiator was young, between 16 and 30 years old, predominantly male, though women did exist in the system, though Rome later tried to erase this fact. Largely from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, with very few elite Romans ever choosing this path. The dead rates varied wildly, depending on your status and fighting type. The famous fighters, the ones Rome invested in, had much better survival odds. They received better medical care. They fought opponents more carefully selected. Their deaths were managed and delayed. But the nameless thousands who filled the lower tiers of the arena had no such protection. What's most striking is the erasure. We know the names of perhaps a few hundred famous gladiators out of tens of thousands who fought across the centuries. Why do we know these names? Because powerful people cared enough to remember them. Because they won often enough, or spectacularly enough, that their names were recorded in official documents that survived. But for every named fighter, there were hundreds whose names were never written down, or were written down but the records were lost or deliberately destroyed. These forgotten men died in the same sand. They suffered the same injuries. They experienced the same terror, but nobody powerful cared to remember them. And so they were erased, converted into statistics, treated as if they had never existed at all. Yet before they reached the arena, they passed through something else. A place of transformation. A place where the process of turning a man into a fighter truly began. A modern prison is designed to contain people. A modern military barracks is designed to train soldiers. The ludus was designed to do both those things, and something darker besides. It was designed to remake human beings entirely, to strip away identity and rebuild it, to break consciousness and reconstruct it in a form useful to the state. Archaeological evidence and historical accounts paint a picture that is almost scientific in its horror. When a man arrived at the ludus, he was not simply registered and trained, he was systematically dismantled. Literally. He was separated from his family, any family he had, whether wife or children or siblings. He was given a new name. This wasn't metaphorical. His birth identity was removed and replaced with something else. Sometimes a single word. Sometimes a description of his fighting style or body type. In removing his name, Rome was removing his past. He was being reborn as property, as a commodity, as a tool. The daily regimen was brutal beyond what most people can imagine. Physical conditioning that pushed bodies to the edge of failure, and sometimes beyond it. Specialized diets designed with disturbing precision, high in ash and other minerals, to build bone density in specific ways, but lower in certain fats to keep body weight controlled. This was calculated. Not cruel in a mindless way, but cruel in a purposeful way. They wanted fighters who were explosive, fast, capable of sudden violence. But they also wanted fighters who would break under the right kind of pressure. The diet literally affected bone structure, making fighters stronger in certain ways and more fragile in others. A fighter conditioned this way might be more deadly in combat, but he would also be more easily killed. That was intentional. The psychological conditioning was perhaps more sophisticated than the physical. Within the ludus, a rigid hierarchy was established, based on skill and brutality. This hierarchy was maintained through violence. Stronger fighters had higher status. This encouraged constant internal conflict. Men competed against each other even in training. They learned not to trust each other. They learned that cooperation meant subordination and that advancement meant domination. And yet, sometimes, despite all this, something broke in the system. The most famous example is Spartacus, the gladiator who organized a rebellion of enslaved fighters and led them in an uprising against Rome itself. The fact that he was able to do this, despite the ludus's psychological control, suggests something important, that these systems, no matter how sophisticated, were never perfectly effective. That human consciousness remained capable of resistance. That some men found ways to see past the conditioning, to remember themselves. What the ludus also reveals is Rome's investment in understanding human trauma and survival. The medical knowledge developed within these institutions was sophisticated. Gladiator doctors studied wound treatment, infection prevention, pain management, and the body's response to violence. They developed techniques for keeping men alive after serious trauma so they could fight again. This knowledge was valuable, so valuable that it persisted through history. Medieval physicians studied what gladiator doctors had learned. Military doctors thousands of years later would apply principles first discovered in the ludus. The techniques of control developed in the ludus would influence the Roman military itself. The systematic breaking and rebuilding of identity, the creation of internal hierarchies, the use of violence as a management tool. All of this became part of how Rome created the most disciplined, fearsome military force the ancient world had ever seen. The ludus was a laboratory. Rome was experimenting with total institutional control. And when the experiments proved effective, they were scaled up and applied elsewhere. But no amount of training or psychological preparation could fully prepare a man for what awaited below. Imagine complete darkness. Imagine standing in a confined space beneath tons of stone, hearing sounds echo strangely through chambers you cannot see. Imagine the smell, animal waste, blood, human fear, decay. Imagine knowing that above you, 50,000 people are gathering. That sunlight is flooding into spaces you will soon enter. That when the gates open, your life might end. Imagine not knowing what waits for you, not knowing if you face one opponent or 10, not knowing if animals will be released into the arena with you, not knowing if you're fighting a famous veteran who's survived dozens of battles or a condemned man as terrified as you are. This was the hypogeum, the underground, the hidden infrastructure that made the spectacle possible. Recent archaeological work has revealed that the hypogeum was far more sophisticated than most people realize. It wasn't simply tunnels and holding cells. It was a complex system of mechanical platforms that could be raised to the arena floor by means of counterweights and pulleys. water channels that could be flooded on command to transform the arena into a lake for naval battles, trapdoors that opened without warning, cages organized in a vast grid, each holding specific animals or fighters, a tunnel system that connected directly to the gladiator barracks miles away, allowing fighters to be moved to the Colosseum entirely underground, meaning spectators never saw them arrive. The engineering was remarkable. The Romans had clearly understood hydraulics and mechanics at a level that shouldn't have been possible with ancient technology. Yet the evidence is physical. It's still there. You can still see the wear marks where pulleys operated, still see channels where water flowed, still see the architectural blueprint of a system designed to move bodies and animals and terror with mechanical precision. But what makes the Hypogeum truly horrifying is what it reveals about intentionality. Every feature served a purpose. The darkness wasn't accidental. It was designed to create disorientation and terror. The separation between different chambers meant that fighters in one section couldn't see or communicate with fighters in another. They didn't know how many others were down there. They didn't know the scale of what was about to happen. Each fighter was isolated in darkness, waiting for the moment when gates would open and sunlight would come. Ancient graffiti found scratched into the walls of the Hypogeum provides direct testimony from people who stood in that darkness. Simple messages, names, prayers. In some cases, what appears to be the final words of men about to die. These scratches are direct voices from people 2,000 years dead. Evidence that someone, at some point, stood in the darkness and thought to leave a mark, to say, "I was here, I existed." The Hypogeum served two purposes simultaneously. It was practical infrastructure, a necessary system for managing the logistics of moving thousands of animals and hundreds of fighters, and coordinating the complex machinery of the spectacle. But it was also a psychological weapon, a place of imprisonment in darkness, where a man's mind had nothing to do but contemplate what might happen next, where fear could work on the imagination unopposed, where the anticipation of death was almost worse than death itself. Few people have actually descended into the Hypogeum. Archaeological access is limited. Most people never encounter this space. Most people studying the Colosseum never see what exists beneath it. And perhaps that's intentional too. Perhaps understanding the scale and sophistication of what's below would change how we understand what happened above. But above, in the sunlight and heat, the spectacle was about to begin. When we think of gladiatorial combat, most people imagine brute strength, two men swinging weapons until one falls, raw violence requiring little skill. But this image is almost entirely wrong. What Rome actually developed was far more sophisticated. It was, in many ways, a proto-science of combat. A systematic understanding of how bodies move, how weapons work, how to defeat specific types of opponents using specific techniques. The Murmillo was the classic fighter most Romans visualized when they thought of gladiators, heavily armored, carrying a short sword and a large rectangular shield. The advantages were obvious: protection and power. The disadvantages were equally clear: slower movement, more exhaustion from carrying the weight. The Murmillo was designed to dominate in prolonged combat, to wear opponents down through superior endurance and defensive capability. But the Murmillo had a natural enemy: the retiarius. The trident fighter was lightly armored, carrying a trident and a net. Where the Murmillo relied on armor, the retiarius relied on speed and distance. The trident's reach was greater than the Murmillo's sword. The net could entangle an armored opponent and render his advantages useless. These weren't random matchups. Organizers understood the rock, paper, scissors logic of combat types. A retiarius might lose to a Thracian fighter with a curved sword and superior footwork, while that same Thracian might fall to a hoplomachus with Greek-style tactics and different weapon combinations. Each style had specific strengths and specific vulnerabilities. The physical demands were extraordinary. A fighter needed explosive power, the ability to generate force quickly in sudden bursts. But he also needed endurance, because combat could last hours under the Mediterranean sun. He needed proprioception, the awareness of his own body in space, because a single misstep could mean death. He needed psychological resilience because part of combat was mental reading, an opponent, understanding intention, maintaining focus while experiencing pain and fear, and the overwhelming sensory assault of noise from 50,000 screaming people. Historical accounts describe specific techniques with remarkable detail. The feint, the false attack, designed to make an opponent respond incorrectly. The counter-thrust, striking at an opponent who is overextended. The disarm, using superior technique to strip a weapon from an opponent's hand. These were refined techniques, developed over decades, passed between fighters the way a martial artist today passes technique to students. Some fighters became famous specifically for signature moves. A particular way of holding a shield that made their defense nearly impenetrable. A specific footwork pattern that made them nearly impossible to predict. Medical evidence confirms that certain techniques were particularly effective. Skeletal remains show characteristic injuries that suggest repeated use of specific killing methods. Wounds to the femoral artery suggesting that fighters learned where to strike to cause rapid bleeding. Puncture wounds to the chest cavity that would have caused death within minutes. Blows to the head that fractured skulls in characteristic patterns, suggesting deliberate targeting of vital areas. This wasn't random violence. This was the systematic application of lethal knowledge. What's most striking is that some combat could be incredibly quick. A first strike that connected perfectly could end a fight almost immediately. But combat could also extend for hours, both fighters exhausted, both bleeding, both driven by a kind of survival instinct that transcends pain. The psychological toll of this uncertainty was deliberate. An opponent might fall in seconds, or might survive an afternoon of your best efforts to kill him. You couldn't know. You had to prepare for both possibilities simultaneously. Some fighters became celebrities not just because they won often, but because they won spectacularly. They understood instinctively what the crowds wanted to see. Not just victory, but a particular style of victory, a particular way of moving that was recognizable and distinctive. They were developing personal brands, understanding that fame meant survival, that being memorable meant being valuable to the system. They were ancient athletes in the truest sense, and they understood the mechanics of their own celebrity. But all of this, the techniques, the strategies, the psychological games, was only part of what was happening above. Below the arena, in darkness and preparation, a different kind of drama was unfolding. The Colosseum was not simply a venue. It was a machine designed to produce specific emotional states in large populations simultaneously. Understanding how it worked means understanding how any institution manages collective consciousness. Start with the architecture. The seating arrangement wasn't random. The best seats were positioned for the elite, the wealthy, the connected, the powerful. They had clear sight lines. They were close enough to see details. But more importantly, they were visible to everyone else. Their presence itself was part of the spectacle. Then there were the middle sections, where moderately wealthy citizens sat. And then the upper tiers, where the poor stood or sat on stone benches, far from the action, but still part of the crowd. This wasn't just seating arrangement. It was a physical manifestation of social hierarchy. Everyone could see where they stood, relative to everyone else. Literally. The sight lines were engineered so that no matter where you sat, you felt implicated in what happened in the arena. You couldn't look away without conscious effort. The attention was designed to be captured and held. The acoustics meant that sound amplified in ways that made you feel surrounded, immersed, part of something larger than yourself. 50,000 people in one space created a roar of sound that was almost physical. It moved through your body. The crowds didn't respond randomly. Roman sources describe organized chants. The crowd roaring approval or disapproval in synchronized waves. What this tells us is that crowd response was to some degree orchestrated, not completely predetermined that would undermine the spectacle, but guided. Certain people in the crowd would start chants or expressions of emotion. Others would follow. The emotional tone was being shaped from within the crowd itself, but with deliberate direction from those who understood how crowds worked. Betting was constant. Romans gambled on gladiatorial combat, the way we gamble on sports. This wasn't peripheral. The betting meant that ordinary citizens had financial investment in outcomes. Their emotional responses were not just aesthetic appreciation, but economic interest. They cared who won because they had money riding on it. This deepened engagement. This made people pay closer attention. This made crowds more volatile. The emperor's position was particularly clever. He appeared to be at the mercy of the crowd's judgment. When a fighter was defeated, the crowd would vote thumbs up or down on whether he lived or died. This created the illusion of popular participation, of democratic decision-making. But the emperor controlled the frame. He controlled when games happened, what matchups occurred, how long the spectacle lasted. He appeared to submit to crowd judgment while maintaining ultimate authority. The crowd felt powerful, but the emperor controlled the machinery that made that power possible. What's most sophisticated is that this system created a kind of collective consciousness. 50,000 individuals became a single entity. They felt the same things at the same times. They moved together. They roared together. They voted together. Individual consciousness was subsumed into collective experience. This wasn't accidental. This was the entire point. The spectacle was designed to teach people what it felt like to surrender individual consciousness to something larger, to participate in collective judgment, to feel power as part of a crowd while actually being controlled by the machinery of the institution. And the mechanisms developed in the Colosseum, the understanding of how to manipulate mass emotion, how to create synchronized responses, how to maintain control, while appearing to serve the crowd, these principles haven't disappeared. They've evolved. They've been refined. They appear in modern entertainment and political theater and mass media. Understanding the Colosseum isn't just understanding ancient Rome. It's understanding the principles that still operate today. But the crowd above was making decisions about lives below. And those lives were ending in ways that were far from quick or clean. Imagine the moment when you realize you're going to lose. When the fight has gone on long enough that you understand your opponent is better than you, faster, more skilled, more willing to take risks. Your body is exhausted. Your arms are heavy. Your breathing is labored. You've been bleeding from small cuts for what feels like hours. And above you, 50,000 people are roaring. They're screaming. They're chanting. They're invested in the moment when your life ends. Medical evidence tells us what death actually looked like. A thrust to the femoral artery, the large vein in the thigh, would cause a fighter to bleed out in minutes. Initially, most people wouldn't even realize they were dying. The wound would seem manageable, but within moments, blood loss would cause dizziness, disorientation, confusion. A fighter might collapse without understanding why. Consciousness would fade. Death would come relatively quickly, which sounds merciful until you consider the terror of not knowing why your body was failing. A puncture wound to the chest was different, more immediately apparent. If a gladiator took a trident or a sword through the ribs, he would know immediately that he was mortally wounded. The pain would be extraordinary. Breathing would become difficult. Blood might fill the lungs. Death might take minutes or longer, depending on precisely where the wound was. A fighter could lie on the sand, conscious, dying slowly, waiting for the final blow that would end it. A head wound was unpredictable. A sword strike to the skull might kill instantly, or might cause a slow, lingering death, accompanied by neurological breakdown. Sometimes fighters survived head wounds that seemed fatal. Sometimes wounds that seemed survivable turned out to be lethal due to infections that developed days or weeks later. The question of mercy is complicated. The tradition of the thumbs up meaning life, thumbs down meaning death, this appears to have been a real practice in some forms. A defeated fighter could appeal to the crowd for mercy. Sometimes mercy was granted, but other times it wasn't. And what determined whether mercy was granted? Status, apparently. Famous fighters who had won many times might be spared. Unknown fighters, men with no reputation, men whose deaths wouldn't prevent future victories, those deaths were more likely to be demanded. The crowd voted, but the vote reflected social hierarchies. A famous fighter's life had value. An unknown fighter's life had less value. After death came removal. The Colosseum employed people whose specific job was to manage bodies, to carry them from the sand, to collect blood that could be used in various treatments, to dispose of remains. This was done constantly, death after death after death, an industrial process, which means bodies couldn't all receive individual treatment. Some were given to families for proper burial. Some were cremated in mass ceremonies. Many were simply disposed of in ways we don't fully understand. Archaeological evidence suggests mass graves existed, locations where thousands of bodies were deposited over years or decades, unnamed, forgotten, reduced to remains. Yet there's evidence of something else too. In some cases, stones were placed with gladiator graves, marking their names, their ages, their records. Someone cared enough to mark the place where they were buried. In other cases, graffiti from spectators appeared praising specific fallen fighters. Written on walls days or weeks after death, remembering someone who had impressed them, small acts of commemoration in a system designed to erase. The spiritual dimension remains uncertain. Did fighters believe in an afterlife that would compensate for earthly suffering? Did some seek death as redemption? Religious inscriptions found near the Colosseum suggest that some brought faith with them, seeking meaning in suffering. But others might have experienced death as meaningless ending, consciousness simply ceasing, all the terror and pain and effort simply stopping into nothing. What's undeniable is that death in the Colosseum was industrial and vast. Thousands died there. Thousands of individual traumas, individual terrors, individual endings of consciousness. And they've been largely forgotten. History remembers the famous fighters and the great battles. History romanticizes the spectacle. But the thousands who died unnamed, whose bodies were disposed of, whose final moments were recorded in no chronicle, they're gone. The machinery of the spectacle ground on, indifferent to individual death, because there was always more death coming, always more bodies to fill the arena, always more spectacle to produce. But why? Why did Rome require this constant supply of death? What purpose did it serve beyond entertainment? To understand the Colosseum, you have to understand Rome's greatest fear. Not barbarians at the borders, though those existed. Not plague or disaster, though those came periodically. Rome's deepest fear was its own people. The population of Rome itself, hungry, crowded, increasingly disconnected from the power structures that governed them. A population that could turn violent, that could organize, that could revolt. By the 2nd century CE, Rome was something like a modern megacity, except without the infrastructure we associate with managing huge populations. Hundreds of thousands of people lived in Rome proper. Most were poor. Many were slaves. The wealth inequality was staggering. The gap between an emperor who could own entire provinces and a laborer who couldn't afford bread was not just economic, it was existential. Two completely different kinds of human beings. Rome's elite understood something crucial, that poverty and idleness combined created revolutionary potential. An idle population was a dangerous population. People with time to think were people who might start asking uncomfortable questions. Why do I have nothing while others have everything? Why do I work while others rule? These were questions the empire could not afford to have asked too loudly. So Rome developed a solution. Keep the population occupied. Keep them entertained. Most importantly, keep them invested in spectacle rather than governance. This wasn't conscious conspiracy in a modern sense. It was simply how power operated. Give people bread, literal bread, subsidized grain that the state provided, and give them circuses. Entertainment so compelling that the conditions of their lives became secondary to the spectacle they were consuming. The games weren't marginal. They weren't occasional entertainment. They were systematic, regular, and massively funded. During certain periods, games were held nearly constantly. Multiple days per week, sometimes lasting from sunrise to sunset. The financial expense was extraordinary. During economic crises, when the empire was struggling for resources, the games were maintained. Sometimes increased, because cancelling the games was politically dangerous. When the spectacle was disrupted, riots occurred. Social breakdown followed. History records multiple instances of the population becoming violent when games were suspended or when they were deemed inadequate. This tells us something important about how the system worked. The games weren't just entertainment that people enjoyed. They had become necessary to social stability. The population had been conditioned to expect them, to depend on them emotionally and psychologically. When the games were removed, withdrawal occurred. Discontent exploded into violence. The ideological function was equally important. In the arena, Romans watched strength triumph. They watched obedience rewarded and defiance punished. They watched an emperor decide the fate of human beings, literally vote between life and death, through the symbol of his thumb. This wasn't just entertainment. It was a political statement repeated over and over. It taught a specific lesson about power. The emperor is godlike. Power flows from above. Some lives have value and some don't. Strength matters. Obedience matters. The powerful make decisions about the powerless. Successful games increased an emperor's popularity and legitimacy. Emperors who provided spectacular games were loved by the population. Emperors who cancelled games or provided inadequate spectacles were hated. The spectacle was a direct tool of political power. An emperor who understood how to manage the spectacle could maintain control over a huge population. An emperor who didn't understand, who miscalculated, could lose that population's allegiance. The games also functioned as a massive psychological experiment. They taught the population to value spectacle over substance, to participate in collective judgment and collective violence, to surrender individual moral responsibility and accept collective decision-making, to watch death and suffering without question, to accept a hierarchical society where some lived in luxury while others died for entertainment. This wasn't just entertainment, it was conditioning, and it was remarkably effective. But who exactly was being consumed by this machine? Not all people were equally expendable. Rome had a careful taxonomy of human value. At the top were the wealthy and connected. At the bottom were those who could be used and discarded without consequence. The arena drew from the bottom. Where did fighters come from? The sources were systematic and deliberate. Prisoners of war soldiers defeated in Rome's endless territorial expansion. These men were useful because their deaths served double purpose. They removed potential enemies, and they provided entertainment. Criminals condemned to death by Rome's harsh legal system. Rather than execute them privately, put them in the arena. Let their deaths serve the spectacle. The poor and desperate who voluntarily sold themselves because starvation seemed worse than combat. And enslaved people purchased or captured and forced into the system because their owners could profit from their deaths more than they could profit from their labor. Certain regions became particularly associated with providing gladiators. North Africa, the Middle East, parts of Eastern Europe. Rome developed efficient supply chains, almost industrial pipelines converting conquered populations into arena fodder. Evidence suggests that lanistas, the owners of gladiator schools, would travel to provinces specifically to purchase fighters, sometimes capturing people, sometimes negotiating with local authorities, sometimes buying the desperately poor who had no other options. Medical evidence reveals something disturbing. Certain categories of fighters had significantly higher mortality rates. Unknown fighters. Fighters from specific regions deemed less valuable. Fighters assigned to certain fighting styles that were inherently more dangerous. This wasn't random. This was deliberate. Matchups were sometimes constructed not to create fair fights, but to ensure deaths of fighters deemed expendable. The system needed fresh bodies continuously. Some fighters were protected because they were famous and valuable. Others were sacrificed because they were replaceable. The economics created a perverse incentive structure. Lanistas who owned fighters wanted to maximize their lifespan because fighters could be fought multiple times and generate profit through multiple appearances. But the crowds wanted death. They wanted to see blood and gore. This created tension. Lanistas had incentive to preserve fighters. The crowds had incentive to destroy them. The compromise was that some fighters were protected and some were sacrificed. The famous ones, celebrities with loyal fan bases, were preserved. The nameless ones could be destroyed without consequence. What's most revealing is the legal status of the dead. Many gladiators had no families to claim their bodies, no property, no legal standing in Roman society. Their deaths created no legal consequences because they weren't considered fully human in the eyes of the law. This wasn't unusual in Rome. Slavery meant that some people were legally non-persons, but it applied particularly harshly to gladiators. A man could die in the arena and simply be disposed of. No inquiry, no record, no memorial. The system of expendability extended beyond fighters. The Colosseum required constant maintenance. Construction crews, animal handlers, people who managed the machinery, people who removed bodies and cleaned the sand. Thousands of slaves and workers maintained the spectacle. Many of them died in accidents. crushed by machinery, killed by animals, simply worked to death. These deaths were barely recorded. These people were infrastructure, and infrastructure wear and break and requires replacement. But some of those who died in or around the arena couldn't simply be erased without notice. Some had status, some had families, some had names that mattered, and yet their deaths were still concealed. History is written by the victors and the powerful, but sometimes, if you look carefully enough at what's been deliberately hidden, you can reconstruct what people in power wanted forgotten. There is one category of people whose participation in the arena was so controversial that Rome rewrote history to erase them. Women fought in the Colosseum. This isn't speculative. Evidence exists. Legal records mention female gladiators, graffiti praising specific women fighters, scattered references in historical accounts. Yet official histories minimize or ignore this entirely. Why? Because the spectacle of women fighting, women dying, women covered in blood in front of 50,000 people, violated something in Roman ideology. It violated the carefully constructed narrative of what women were supposed to be. Some women were enslaved fighters like the men, trained in ludices, forced to fight, forced to die. But the historical record is deliberately sparse about this. When female fighters are mentioned, they're often mentioned dismissively, as if their participation was rare or unusual. Yet the evidence suggests it was more common than official histories admit. Gradually, over time, Rome banned women from fighting as gladiators. Laws were passed. The practice was formalized as improper. And slowly, the records of female fighters were erased or minimized. But women's participation in the spectacle extended far beyond combat. Enslaved women lived in proximity to the ludices and the Colosseum. Many were forced into sexual servitude before being fed to animals in the arena. This wasn't combat. This was execution dressed as spectacle. Women condemned for crimes that today would be minor adultery, speaking disrespectfully to masters, were sentenced to death by animal, executed in ways that combined sexual humiliation with violence. The historical accounts mention these executions briefly and vaguely, suggesting deliberate suppression of detail. There are accounts of women who attempted suicide rather than appear in the arena, women who fought back against being forced into the spectacle, women who resisted and were punished for that resistance. Some historians have suggested that certain moral panics in later Roman periods, official expressions of concern about women fighting, might indicate that the practice had once been more common and systematic, that Rome's elite had decided it needed to be hidden and suppressed. The reason for suppression seems ideological. Women dying for entertainment was uncomfortable for Roman society, or more precisely, it was uncomfortable for those who controlled historical narrative. It violated the idea of women as protected or protected but subordinate. It revealed that the system would consume women as readily as it consumed men. That protection was conditional on obedience. That any woman could become disposable. And so the records were altered, histories were rewritten, references were minimized. The story of women in the arena became a footnote, then a mystery, then something that didn't officially happen at all. What remains are fragments, scattered mentions, graffiti, archaeological evidence that contradicts official narratives. But the deliberate erasure tells us something important. Rome had to erase this history. The fact that it's been hidden suggests how disturbing the truth was considered. This is the nature of historical suppression. It's not always about preventing people from discovering things. It's about shaping what gets remembered and what gets forgotten. About constructing narratives that serve those in power. About making certain truths so absent from historical record that they seem never to have happened at all. But Rome couldn't suppress the spectacle forever. Something eventually shifted. The machine that had sustained the empire for centuries began to change. To understand the scale of what happened in the Colosseum, you need to understand something that historians don't often emphasize: the animal trade that sustained it. This wasn't peripheral. It was industrial. It was systematic. And it fundamentally transformed ecosystems across 3 continents. The numbers are staggering. For the inauguration games of the Colosseum alone, when the arena first opened to celebrate its construction, over 9,000 animals were killed. 9,000. In a series of games lasting over 100 days. That's roughly 70 to 80 animals per day, every single day, for more than 3 months. And that was just the opening. The games continued for nearly 400 years. Thousands of arenas operated throughout the empire. The total number of animals killed becomes almost incomprehensible. Hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions over the centuries. Where did they come from? Rome developed sophisticated supply chains. Hunters traveled to North Africa, capturing lions, leopards, and rhinoceroses. Expeditions went to India and beyond, returning with elephants and exotic species most Romans had never seen before. The Middle East provided different predators. Eastern Europe provided bears. These weren't random captures. This was organized, systematic hunting with the specific purpose of supplying the arena trade. The capture process devastated local ecosystems. Hunters didn't just take isolated animals, they destabilized populations. Evidence suggests that certain species became locally extinct, partly due to this overcapture. Regions that had supported thriving populations of predators and exotic animals suddenly found those populations depleted or gone entirely. The environmental impact was similar to what we'd now recognize as an extinction crisis, except it happened for entertainment. Transportation was brutal. Animals captured in Africa had to be transported across deserts, then loaded onto ships, then transported across the Mediterranean to Rome. Many died en route. Disease was rampant. Malnutrition affected the animals. Stress from captivity killed them. Historical records suggest that perhaps only a fraction of captured animals actually survived the journey. This meant that enormous numbers had to be captured to ensure that enough animals reached Rome alive. The capture numbers were far higher than the arena numbers because of this mortality rate. The economics were compelling. Animal traders made enormous profits. Emperors gained prestige from providing exotic animals. The crowds were fascinated. Most Romans would never see a lion or an elephant or a rhinoceros in any other context. The arena provided that experience. That spectacle value was powerful. It created demand. Demand drove the trade. The trade drove hunting. The hunting drove species toward extinction. Historical accounts describe specific animals and battles in detail. Rampaging elephants that killed dozens of fighters, charging rhinoceroses that tossed men into the air, lions that had been starved to increase aggression, wild boars, panthers, bears. Creatures brought so far from their native habitats that they behaved unpredictably. Sometimes the animals were unprepared for the heat and noise of the arena. Sometimes they attacked each other instead of humans. The spectacle was real and dangerous and uncontrolled in ways that fascinated observers. What's interesting is that some Romans did question this. Historical sources reveal moral objection to the scale of animal slaughter. Philosophers expressed concern. Some voiced opposition. But these objections were marginal voices. The demand for spectacle overrode moral concern. The system continued because the people in power benefited from it, and the crowds demanded it. The animals themselves were voiceless victims of a machinery of death. They hadn't chosen to be captured. They hadn't chosen to be transported thousands of miles. They hadn't chosen to face unfamiliar environments and hostile creatures and 50,000 screaming humans. They were simply consumed by a system that treated all life, human and animal, as resources to be exploited for entertainment. But behind the animal battles lay something even darker. Not every death in the Colosseum was combat. Not every person placed in the arena had been trained. Some were simply condemned, placed in an arena with animals, and left to die. The Romans had a name for this: damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to beasts. This wasn't punishment for serious crimes alone. Yes, murderers were condemned this way, but so were political prisoners, people who had spoken against the emperor, tax evaders, people guilty of sexual misconduct, heretics, Christians, anyone the state deemed necessary to eliminate in a public way. The crime list expanded and contracted depending on who held power and what they wanted to suppress. What distinguished damnatio ad bestias from gladiatorial combat was the absence of any possibility of survival. A gladiator could win. A gladiator could fight for years and accumulate wealth and status. But someone condemned to the beasts had no such possibility. Death was certain. The only variable was how long it would take and how public it would be. The logistics of these executions reveal something disturbing about the sophistication of the spectacle. The condemned weren't simply thrown into an arena with animals. The executions were choreographed, dramatic. Sometimes the condemned were made to reenact mythological scenes. A condemned woman would be positioned as Dido, set on fire as a lion approached. Condemned men would be bound as Prometheus, with birds released to attack them. This wasn't just execution. This was theatre, political messaging disguised as entertainment. The condemned sometimes resisted. Historical accounts mention prisoners attempting to escape, fighting back. Some accounts describe individuals who seemed resigned to death, while others fought frantically against their fate. The psychological dimension was immense. A person condemned to damnatio ad bestias knew with absolute certainty that they would die, that their death would be witnessed, that the death would be recorded and remembered and used as political message, that their terror and suffering would become entertainment. Some were weaponless. Others were given weapons in mockery, a sword that couldn't cut, a shield that wouldn't protect. The illusion of possibility. The condemned would stand in the arena with inadequate equipment against animals that wanted to eat them. What chance did they actually have? Minimal to none. But the spectacle preserved the appearance of combat, of possibility, of struggle. Roman attitudes toward these executions were complex. Some accepted damnatio ad bestias as justice, deserved punishment for serious crimes. Others expressed discomfort with the practice. Questions emerged about whether such spectacles were necessary or whether they revealed something troubling about Roman society. But these were minority voices. The majority watched. The spectacle continued. What damnatio ad bestias reveals is something crucial about how state power operates. The state didn't simply execute political enemies privately. It executed them publicly, turning death into spectacle, turning terror into entertainment, using the condemned person's final moments as political messaging. Every condemned Christian fed to beasts was a message. This is what happens to those who question authority. Every executed rebel was a demonstration of power. The spectacle was the point. Making death public was the point. Transforming suffering into entertainment was the point. The Colosseum wasn't just a venue. It was a tool of state terror, dressed in the language of entertainment. But even this vast machinery of death and spectacle eventually began to change. Change doesn't usually happen suddenly. A system as vast and profitable as the gladiatorial spectacle system doesn't simply vanish because someone decided it was wrong. Change happens gradually, through accumulation of pressures and shifts in consciousness and alteration of circumstances. The first pressure came from philosophy. Even in Rome's earliest centuries, some thinkers questioned whether spectacle served any legitimate purpose. Philosophers argued that watching death and violence corrupted the soul. That participation in collective judgment of human life was morally troubling. That perhaps societies could maintain order without requiring constant spectacle. These voices were marginal, they were often ignored, but they existed. They suggested that alternative ways of thinking were possible. The second pressure came from Christianity. As Christianity spread through the empire and gained political power, it brought with it an explicit ideology opposed to gladiatorial combat. Christian theology held that human life was sacred, that violence was sinful, that death for entertainment violated fundamental moral principles. By the 4th century, Christianity had become powerful enough to shape state policy. Emperor Constantine, who converted to Christianity, began restricting games. Decrees were issued, limiting how often games could be held. Enforcement was sporadic, but the direction was clear. The state was withdrawing its support. The third pressure was economic. By the late 4th and early 5th centuries, the Western Roman Empire was fragmenting. Resources were scarcer. The cost of maintaining spectacular games was becoming unsustainable. Funding dried up. Games became less frequent, less lavish. They continued in some regions longer than others, but the trajectory was unmistakable. The economic machinery that had sustained the spectacle for centuries was breaking down. The combination of these pressures, philosophical objection, religious opposition, and economic constraint, led to a gradual decline. By the early 5th century, the final documented gladiatorial games in Rome occurred. The practice wasn't abolished immediately. It didn't disappear everywhere simultaneously. In some provinces and regions, similar spectacles continued for centuries. But in Rome itself, in the heart of the empire, the system gradually shut down. What's important is that this wasn't revolutionary change. There was no moment when Romans collectively decided that the spectacle had to end. Instead, it was erosion. Gradual erosion of support, of funding, of cultural acceptance. The moral objections that had always existed suddenly became powerful enough to matter. The religious objections that had been marginal suddenly had political backing. The economic reality that had previously been sustained through political will suddenly couldn't be sustained anymore. Did this represent moral progress? Perhaps. Or perhaps it simply represented circumstance. Economic collapse forcing societies to abandon practices they couldn't afford. Religious ideology replacing previous ideology. Power shifting hands in ways that made the old system less politically useful. The question of whether it was genuine moral evolution or simply historical contingency remains open. Probably both factors were involved. Morality and circumstance are rarely entirely separable. The knowledge developed in the arena didn't disappear. Medical knowledge about treating trauma, combat techniques, understanding of how to condition humans for violence, these persisted. They were incorporated into military training. They influenced how subsequent empires organized their forces. The arena's techniques lived on even after the arena itself was emptied. The Colosseum remained standing, silent now, empty of its original purpose. But the structure itself became a symbol, a reminder, eventually a warning. The spectacle had ended, but its legacy persisted in the stones themselves, in the systems that emerged from it, in the consciousness of those who came after. History is not discovered. It is constructed. This is what most people don't understand when they think about historical knowledge. We imagine that historians simply uncover facts that have always existed, waiting to be found. In reality, historians make choices. They select certain sources and ignore others. They prioritize certain interpretations and marginalize alternatives. They frame narratives in ways that make certain conclusions seem inevitable, while rendering other conclusions invisible. The history of the Colosseum and gladiatorial combat is a perfect example of this construction process. The sources that have survived are not objective records of what actually happened. They are fragments written by specific people with specific interests. Roman writers who documented the games sometimes romanticized them, sometimes criticized them, sometimes wrote about them with complete indifference, treating them as routine. We have letters from officials, accounts from philosophers, graffiti from the streets, poetry praising fighters. All of these exist. All are equally historical sources. But which ones historians prioritize shapes what we understand about the games. Consider a basic example. Almost everyone knows the story about the thumbs down gesture meaning death, and thumbs up meaning survival. This narrative is so embedded in popular culture that it feels like historical fact. Yet historians now suspect this popular understanding is largely a modern construction. The actual historical evidence for how crowds indicated whether a defeated fighter should live or die is ambiguous. The thumbs gestures may have meant something entirely different. Yet the thumbs narrative persists because it's dramatic, it's simple, it's memorable. It fits into the narrative structure that modern storytellers prefer. This is how historical knowledge actually works. Popular narratives survive not because they're most supported by evidence, but because they're most useful for the stories we want to tell. They're clearer, more dramatic, more satisfying. The primary sources themselves have biases built into them. We have extensive accounts from Rome's elite emperors, wealthy citizens, educated observers. We have almost no perspectives from enslaved people, from the condemned, from the poor who actually filled most of the arena. The absence of these perspectives shapes what we know. We understand gladiatorial combat through the eyes of people who benefited from the system, or who observed it from positions of comfort. We almost never hear from those who suffered within it. Modern historians have inherited these biases and added their own. 19th and 20th century scholars working with their own cultural assumptions, interpreted Roman games through contemporary lenses. Some emphasized entertainment value because they came from cultures where entertainment was a primary lens for understanding leisure. Others emphasized political function because they were studying systems of power. Still others focused on economic dimensions. Each scholarly school constructed a version of the Colosseum that reflected their own priorities and frameworks. The truth is that all these interpretations have merit. The Colosseum was simultaneously entertainment and political tool, and economic system and mechanism of psychological control. Complete understanding requires synthesizing perspectives while acknowledging what remains genuinely uncertain. But most histories don't do this. Most histories pick a frame and construct a narrative within that frame, presenting it as truth rather than as one possible interpretation. Whether this suppression of information is deliberate or unconscious varies. Some historians consciously choose to downplay certain aspects because they don't fit their narrative. Others genuinely don't see what they're not looking for. The human mind is good at filtering. We see what we expect to see and miss what falls outside our attention. This isn't conspiracy. It's how consciousness works. But the cumulative effect is real. Certain narratives persist. Certain truths remain marginal. Certain questions go unasked. And anyone studying the Colosseum is inheriting these accumulated choices, these forgotten perspectives, these constructed narratives. This documentary itself is another interpretation, another construction shaped by choices about what to emphasize and what to leave aside. Understanding that is important. Understanding that all knowledge is constructed doesn't mean it's false. It means it's incomplete. It means there's always more to discover if you're willing to look beyond the established narratives. But where do you look? Where can you find information that hasn't been filtered through centuries of interpretation? Physical evidence doesn't lie. It can be misinterpreted. It can be incomplete. It can be read through different frameworks. But bones and stone and artifacts don't have agendas. They simply exist. And what they reveal about the Colosseum sometimes confirms written accounts and sometimes contradicts them dramatically. Start with skeletal remains. Archaeologists have examined the bones of gladiators and victims recovered from burial sites near the Colosseum. These remains tell stories that no written account could convey. The injuries visible on bone reveal the types of combat that occurred. Healed fractures show previous trauma. Many fighters bear evidence of multiple severe injuries that they survived, suggesting long careers as gladiators. Other remains show single catastrophic injuries, suggesting fighters who died in their first or second encounter. The pattern of healed versus fatal injuries provides direct evidence of survival rates that written sources never specify. The bones also reveal something about diet. Isotopic analysis, a technique that examines the chemical composition of bone, shows what people ate. Gladiators ate differently than the general population. Their diets were high in certain minerals, low in others. This confirms the historical accounts describing specialized diets designed to condition fighters. The physical evidence validates the ancient narratives, but it also reveals details that written sources never recorded. DNA analysis has revealed something surprising. Gladiators came from much farther away than many historians assumed. Genetic markers indicate fighters from North Africa, the Middle East, Eastern Europe, and beyond. This supports the historical evidence of systematic recruitment across the empire, but the genetic evidence is more precise. It shows the actual geographic distribution of fighters. It shows populations, not just individuals. The Colosseum structure itself tells stories through careful archaeological examination. The hypogeum, the underground chambers, contains artifacts that reveal daily life. Graffiti scratched into stone by workers or gladiators waiting to fight. Refuse, indicating what people ate. Structural modifications, showing how the system was altered and improved over centuries. Tools left behind. All these fragments create a portrait of the actual conditions within the structure. Animal bone evidence reveals which species were used in games. The size of bones indicates the animal's ages. Injuries on the bones show how they died. This evidence has revealed that certain animals used in games were smaller or younger than historical accounts suggested, changing our understanding of the spectacles. Some accounts described massive elephants and enormous lions. Physical evidence sometimes contradicts these descriptions, suggesting that either the accounts were exaggerated or that different animals were used than we assumed. Burial sites associated with the Colosseum reveal patterns in how bodies were disposed of. Some were treated with care, suggesting family members received remains for proper burial. Others were dumped in mass graves with little ceremony. The differential treatment visible in the archaeological record confirms that fighters and victims had different social status, even in death. Some people cared enough to claim and honor the dead. Others were simply disposed of as waste. Newer technologies are changing our understanding constantly. CT scanning reveals internal injuries on skeletal remains that weren't visible to earlier archaeologists. Three-dimensional modeling allows us to reconstruct how the Colosseum actually looked and functioned. DNA sequencing reveals genetic information that earlier methods couldn't access. Each new technological development reveals information that earlier archaeology missed. Our understanding continues to evolve. What's crucial about archaeological evidence is that it operates independently of narrative bias. An artifact can't be consciously exaggerated or minimized the way a written account can. Physical evidence simply is. It resists easy interpretation. It refuses to be forced into narratives that don't fit. The sand and stone and bones have preserved information that written history deliberately or unconsciously obscured. But archaeology itself is interpretation. How we read the physical evidence depends on the frameworks we bring to it. Two archaeologists examining the same skeletal remains might draw different conclusions depending on their assumptions about what the evidence means. The bones themselves don't interpret themselves. We interpret them. But the physical evidence constrains our interpretations in ways that written sources don't. The bones say, "This person suffered this injury." The bones don't say whether that's tragic or deserved or necessary, but they establish facts that theories must accommodate. What these bones and fragments reveal is both confirmation and mystery. They validate much of what we know, while raising new questions about what we don't. After centuries of scholarship and decades of archaeological investigation, enormous gaps remain in our understanding. These gaps are not failures of research. They are fundamental limits of historical knowledge. Some questions can never be fully answered because the information has simply been lost. 2,000 years is a long time. Silence accumulates. What are the actual death rates in gladiatorial combat? We don't know with precision. We have estimates. We have fragments of evidence. We have inscriptions noting certain fighters' records. But we don't have comprehensive data covering centuries of games across the entire empire. We can make educated guesses. We can see patterns in the evidence we have. But exact numbers remain inaccessible. Were most games fought to the death, or did many end with surrender and mercy? This question has profound implications for how we understand the system. If fighters regularly survived defeat, the arena was different from what we imagine. If most defeats meant death, it was far more brutal. The evidence is contradictory. Some sources suggest that mercy was common. Others describe brutal deaths as routine. The truth probably lies somewhere in between, varying by time period and context. But we can't know precisely how often fighters survived. What motivated individual fighters to volunteer? We know some fought for glory. Some fought for money. Some fought because they had no choice. But understanding individual psychology across centuries is nearly impossible. We might find an inscription saying a fighter was proud of his victories. But what was he actually thinking as he stood in the arena facing death? What calculations did he make? What fears did he experience? This interiority is fundamentally inaccessible. We can speculate. We can imagine. But we cannot know. Are the famous fighter accounts historically accurate or legendary? Spartacus became legendary. Did the accounts of his rebellion preserve historical truth, or were they altered in retelling? Are certain famous champions mythologized versions of real people, or entirely fictional? We can examine the accounts for internal consistency. We can compare different sources. But separating historical fact from legend remains uncertain. What was the true political function of the games? Did they genuinely maintain social order, or simply create the illusion of doing so? This question probably doesn't have a simple answer. The games likely served multiple functions simultaneously. Some games may have maintained order, Others may have disrupted it. The relationship probably varied depending on context. But understanding the precise relationship between spectacle and social stability remains fundamentally mysterious. Could crowds genuinely influence outcomes, or were outcomes orchestrated? The evidence suggests the answer is yes to both. Some fights were probably genuinely uncertain. Others were probably predetermined, or at least heavily influenced by organizers. But distinguishing between them is nearly impossible from this distance. What did the games reveal about Roman values? Were they aberrations, strange spectacles that didn't reflect how most Romans lived? Or were they crystallizations of deeper values? The answer probably involves recognizing that Rome, like all societies, contained contradictions. The same people who attended games participated in other activities that suggest different values. Understanding how these contradictions coexisted remains genuinely difficult. Some questions may be fundamentally unanswerable. Why did certain emperors make specific decisions? What did certain individuals experience in their final moments? What was it actually like to be in that crowd of 50,000 people? We can imagine. We can construct narratives. But direct knowledge is inaccessible. It's gone. 2,000 years have erased those details. And yet this acknowledgement of limits is important. Honest history acknowledges what cannot be known. It resists false certainty. It remains open to new information. The silence itself becomes part of the story. The gaps in our knowledge tell us something. They tell us that complete understanding is impossible, that history is always partial, that what we think we know is always provisional, always subject to revision when new evidence emerges. But stepping back from these specific mysteries, a larger pattern becomes visible. The Colosseum reveals something about human nature that transcends the specific historical details. You are not so different from a Roman standing in the Colosseum 2,000 years ago. This is uncomfortable to consider, but it's important. Because understanding why you're drawn to spectacle, why millions of people watch combat sports, why true crime documentaries become obsessions, why we refresh our screens for news updates about conflicts and disasters, this understanding reveals something crucial about human nature that transcends any particular historical moment. The Romans didn't create the psychological draw to spectacle. They discovered it. They recognized patterns that were already embedded in human consciousness, and they systematized those patterns. The appeal of watching real danger, the adrenaline response when something momentous is happening, the sense of being present for something that matters. These aren't Roman inventions. They're human responses. Consider what happens when you watch a combat sport. Your heart rate increases, your attention narrows, you become absorbed in the unfolding drama. Someone might be injured. The outcome is genuinely uncertain. You're experiencing vicarious risk, the excitement and tension of danger, without actual personal danger. Your brain activates in patterns similar to how it would activate if you were yourself in combat. This response served evolutionary purposes once. It helped humans survive by keeping them hyper-aware during moments of physical conflict. But now, the response can be triggered by a screen, by pixels, by theatrical performances designed to activate those same ancient mechanisms. Modern entertainment industries understand this perfectly. They've become expert at packaging danger in ways that trigger our evolved psychological responses. Combat sports provide real risk. People actually do get injured or die occasionally. Reality television provides manufactured drama that mimics genuine stakes. Action films provide simulated conflict, edited for maximum emotional impact. Each of these works on the same principle the Romans discovered, that humans are drawn to spectacles that activate our threat response systems. The structure is remarkably consistent. Create a compelling narrative, build anticipation, feature individuals who have embraced risk or danger, create uncertainty about outcomes, build tension to a peak. Release that tension through resolution. This narrative arc activates ancient parts of our brain. It feels important. It feels like something that matters. And because it feels that way, we keep watching. We keep returning. The modern entertainment industry has learned what Rome knew, that you can monetize this response. You can create celebrities from people who embrace risk fighters, extreme athletes, dangerous performers. You can build communities around spectatorship. You can create betting systems that increase emotional investment. People will spend money on this. They will sacrifice sleep, attention, and time for this. Not because they're being manipulated by villainous conspirators, but because the spectacle activates real psychological responses that feel genuinely rewarding. This raises an uncomfortable question. If we're attracted to spectacle for fundamental psychological reasons, if the appeal isn't unique to Rome but reflects how human brains actually work, what does that mean? Does it mean spectacle is inevitable? That we can't escape it? That criticism of the Romans for their love of entertainment is unfair because we're doing essentially the same thing? The answer is probably more nuanced. Yes, humans appear to be psychologically drawn to spectacle. Yes, this isn't unique to Rome or to any particular culture. But being drawn to something doesn't mean we're powerless to shape that attraction. Understanding why we're drawn to spectacle is the first step toward making conscious choices about what spectacles we participate in and what spectacles we create. The Romans didn't have the technological capacity to create alternative forms of engagement. They couldn't fundamentally restructure their relationship to entertainment without collapsing the system that depended on it. But perhaps we're in a different position. Perhaps understanding why the Colosseum worked teaches us something about how to build systems that work differently. Strip away the historical specifics, and the Colosseum and the modern entertainment industry reveal startling parallels. The basic functions are identical: distraction from deeper political problems, maintenance of hierarchical order through shared experience, emotional manipulation, creation of in-groups and out-groups. The specific technologies change, but the underlying mechanisms persist. Consider how modern news media functions. A news organization selects certain stories and ignores others. It frames those stories in particular ways. It builds dramatic tension. It cycles through coverage in patterns designed to maintain attention. It structures information not primarily to inform, but to engage, to keep people watching, to create the feeling that something urgent is happening. Compare this to how the Colosseum structured the experience of spectators, the choice of matchups, the timing of reveals, the architectural design creating specific emotional states. The underlying logic is identical. Capture attention, manipulate emotion, create the sense that something important is occurring. Modern celebrity culture mirrors the gladiator system precisely. We elevate certain individuals to extraordinary fame and wealth. We become emotionally invested in their successes and failures. We consume information about their lives obsessively. We participate in a system that extracts value from their performances and their willingness to expose themselves, their bodies, their emotions, their vulnerabilities to public scrutiny. When they're no longer useful to the system, when their popularity wanes, or when they become damaged goods, we discard them. Move on to the next performer. The structure is identical to how Rome managed famous fighters. Elevate them when they're useful, discard them when they're not. Betting and gambling create the same emotional investment loops. A Roman gambling on a gladiatorial fight had money riding on the outcome. This deepened their engagement. This made them care more intensely about what happened. Modern sports betting works identically. The same principle appears in online gambling connected to reality television competitions. Financial investment increases emotional engagement. It transforms observation into participation. It makes spectators feel like they have stakes in outcomes, even though the outcomes aren't actually their responsibility. The technology of spectacle has evolved dramatically, but the principles haven't. Social media creates artificial crowds. Algorithms optimize for emotional response. Content is designed to create peaks of emotion, outrage, excitement, anxiety, joy, timed for maximum engagement. Billions of people are simultaneously experiencing manufactured emotional states, experiencing them through mediated technologies, but experiencing them nonetheless. We're being shaped by systems designed to shape us. This isn't necessarily conscious conspiracy. Most people working in entertainment or news or social media aren't deliberately thinking about how to manipulate populations. They're simply operating within systems that have built-in incentives to maximize engagement, and engagement correlates with emotional intensity. The spectacle-generating logic is embedded in the system itself. It doesn't need conscious direction. But the effects are real. We're being conditioned, Just as Romans were conditioned, we're learning which emotions matter, what kinds of conflict are entertainment, what kinds of violence are acceptable as spectacle. We're learning to value dramatic tension over nuanced understanding. We're learning to treat serious situations as narratives to be consumed rather than problems to be solved. The question isn't whether these parallels exist. They do. The question is what we do with this knowledge. Do we accept that spectacle systems are inevitable? Do we work to create alternatives? If spectacle systems serve such fundamental human needs, if they activate such deep psychological responses, can we move beyond them? The question itself might be framed incorrectly. Perhaps the goal isn't to eliminate spectacle entirely, but to transform it, to create forms of spectacle that don't require exploitation and suffering to function. What would that look like? Forms of entertainment that emphasize participation rather than observation. Activities where people create rather than consume. Community experiences that don't depend on watching someone risk themselves. Shared activities that generate genuine connection rather than manufactured emotional peaks. These alternatives exist in fragmentary forms: participatory theatre, community art, collaborative problem-solving competitions. But they exist at the margins. They don't generate the profits or the engagement levels that exploitation-based spectacles generate. There's also a deeper question about whether complete elimination of spectacle is even desirable. Humans appear to need spectacle for psychological reasons. We need moments of intensity. We need shared experiences that make us feel connected to others. We need narratives that help us understand ourselves and our world. The question isn't whether we can eliminate spectacle, but whether we can reshape it. Historical examples provide some guidance. Societies have moved away from certain forms of spectacle without collapsing. Public executions disappeared in most of the Western world. Slavery was abolished, despite powerful economic interests benefiting from it. Blood sports were gradually restricted. These transitions weren't sudden. They took centuries. They encountered fierce resistance. They required moral argument, combined with practical circumstances that made the old systems unsustainable. But they happened. What made these transitions possible? Consciousness raising was part of it. People began to question whether the practices were necessary. Moral arguments against them accumulated. But consciousness alone wasn't sufficient. Economic changes made the old systems less necessary. New technologies created alternatives. Religious or philosophical frameworks provided ideological justification for change. The transition typically required multiple pressures operating simultaneously. What would be required for modern spectacle systems to fundamentally transform? Consciousness is part of it. Recognizing how these systems operate, how they manipulate, what they demand, this recognition creates space for different choices. Economic incentives would need to shift. As long as exploitation-based spectacles are maximally profitable, they'll persist. Some form of economic restructuring would probably be necessary. Technological change might help. If technologies emerged that created equally engaging experiences without depending on exploitation, the transition might accelerate. But the most important element might be cultural shift, a genuine change in what we value, what we consider acceptable, what we're willing to participate in. This is slow change, generational change. But it's possible. Societies do gradually shift their moral frameworks. What was once acceptable becomes abhorrent. What was once invisible becomes obvious. This isn't about eliminating entertainment or excitement or shared experience. It's about recognizing that our current systems operate under constraints that aren't inevitable, that alternatives are possible. That consciousness and deliberate choice can shape what systems we create and participate in. Understanding the Colosseum isn't just academic, it's practical. It teaches us what to look for in our own systems, how to recognize exploitation disguised as entertainment, how to ask whether the spectacles we're consuming are requiring suffering to function. Awareness is where change begins. Not the only thing required, but the beginning. And awareness itself can spread, which means change, though slow, is always possible. The Colosseum stands empty now. No crowds roaring, no blood soaking into sand, no animals shrieking in unfamiliar sunlight, just ancient stone, weathered by centuries, cracked and broken, and and slowly reclaimed by nature. When you walk through it, you're walking through spaces designed for chaos that now hold only silence. And that silence is itself a presence. The architectural grandeur remains visible despite the decay. The arches that once channeled 50,000 people now frame sky and trees. The tiered seating where hierarchy was physically performed still rises in concentric circles, though most of the stone has tumbled away. The arena floor is gone. You can see down into the hypogeum now, the underground chambers exposed to daylight, the mechanical systems visible and comprehensible to modern eyes. But the basic structure persists. The bones remain. And those bones tell the story just as clearly as when the place was filled with life and violence. What does it feel like to walk through such a space? Different from reading about it, different from seeing photographs or videos. There's an immediate sensory encounter with scale. The vastness becomes apparent in a way that numbers can't convey. You realize that 50,000 people actually gathered here, that the roar would have been deafening, that the heat radiating from the sand would have been intense. Your body registers the space differently than your mind does from a distance. Medieval people believed the Colosseum was cursed, haunted by the ghosts of those who died there. They kept their distance. They told stories about supernatural presences. In their way, they understood something important, that a place where thousands suffered and died carries that suffering within its stones. That history isn't just intellectual abstraction, it's inscribed physically into spaces. It becomes part of the place itself. The Renaissance discovered the Colosseum differently, as a symbol of classical achievement, a monument to human capability and Roman sophistication. They preserved it, studied it, celebrated it. The shift in interpretation reflected their own cultural values. They wanted to see Rome as triumph rather than tragedy, so that's what they emphasized. Modern times have converted it into a tourist attraction, a destination, a photo opportunity. Millions of people visit each year. They walk through it, take pictures, buy souvenirs. The Colosseum has become a commodity, packaged for consumption. This isn't necessarily wrong, but it does create distance. When something becomes a tourist destination, it can lose its capacity to disturb. It becomes safe, contained, ordinary. Yet the experience of being there persists in changing people. Visitors often report feeling something, not supernatural exactly, but a weight, an awareness, a consciousness that something momentous happened in that space, that lives were lived and lost there, that the ground beneath your feet is literally connected to human suffering. Some visitors are moved to tears, others become reflective. The place doesn't let you forget entirely, even if you're trying to treat it as merely historical or touristic. The question of what the Colosseum is, what it should mean to us, remains open. Is it a monument to engineering achievement? A grave? A warning? A symbol of a fallen empire? A mirror in which we see ourselves? Different people see different things, but all of them are encountering the same physical reality, the same stones, the same space. What's certain is that silence itself carries meaning. When you stand in that enormous amphitheater designed to hold thousands of screaming people, and you hear only wind and footsteps and occasional tourist voices, the absence becomes presence. You're aware of what should be there, of what once was there, of the lives that filled those spaces with sound and terror and blood and death. The silence doesn't erase those ghosts. If anything, it makes them more apparent. The Colosseum didn't simply disappear from history. It persisted. Its influence extended forward through centuries, reshaping how subsequent societies understood entertainment, spectacle, and the management of populations. The template was established. The proof of concept was complete. And though specific forms evolved, the underlying principles remained remarkably consistent. Medieval tournaments echoed the gladiatorial system directly. Knights fought in front of crowds. The violence was real, death was possible, fame and wealth could be achieved through victory. The architecture was different. Tournaments happened in open fields or specially constructed arenas, but the psychology was identical. Crowds gathered to watch men risk themselves. Hierarchies were reinforced through spectacle. The powerful displayed their dominion through control of entertainment. Bullfighting emerged in Spain and Portugal, developing its own form over centuries. Whether it represents direct cultural continuity from Roman spectacle or parallel development remains debated. But the structure is undeniably similar. An animal dies, crowds watch, danger is real. A performer becomes famous through skill and willingness to risk. The emotional mechanics operate along lines established in ancient Rome. The physical architecture persisted too. Amphitheatres continued to be built, theatres designed on Roman principles, and eventually modern sports stadiums, which retain the basic architectural logic of the Colosseum. The tiered seating creating hierarchies. The sightlines engineered so that no spectator feels disconnected from the action. The acoustics shaped to amplify crowd noise. Modern stadiums are colosseums with contemporary materials and technologies, but fundamentally unchanged principles of design. The psychology of spectacle evolved, but didn't fundamentally transform. Combat sports maintained the structure of gladiatorial combat. Two individuals competing, danger present, fame, and wealth available to victors. Professional wrestling combined combat sport with theatrical narrative in ways that would have been instantly recognizable to Romans. The theatrical traditions of performance drew from principles Romans had perfected: building tension, creating dramatic peaks and valleys, manipulating audience emotion through timing and narrative structure. Most significantly, the principles of using spectacle for political control persisted. Medieval and early modern rulers understood what Rome had understood: that spectacle could maintain order. That distraction had political utility, that crowds could be managed through entertainment. This logic appears throughout history. It appears in modern political theatre speeches and debates structured for emotional impact rather than information transfer. It appears in modern news media, which has increasingly adopted entertainment structures. It appears in how events are staged and managed for maximum emotional and political impact. The Colosseum became symbolic in later centuries. Artists and writers used it as metaphor for decline, for the brutality underlying civilization, for human capacity for cruelty. It appeared in paintings as ruin, in literature as warning, in philosophy as illustration of systemic violence. The structure itself became a text that different periods could read in different ways. What remained constant was its power as symbol, its capacity to mean something, to represent something larger than itself. Modern sports stadiums might be the most direct inheritance. Football stadiums, basketball arenas, boxing venues, they retain the Colosseum's basic logic. Thousands gather. Hierarchical seating reflects social status. Narratives are built around individual performers or teams. Gambling is integrated into the experience. Violence is real enough to create genuine danger. What differs is the technology and the specific rules of engagement. But the underlying system is recognizable. The Colosseum adapted to new contexts. Its principles survived because they worked, because they accomplished what they were designed to accomplish: managing populations through spectacle. Understanding this trajectory helps us recognize similar patterns in our own systems. It suggests that recognizing the Colosseum's influence isn't just historical, it's practical. It teaches us to ask which modern structures operate on similar principles, which modern systems use spectacle to distract from deeper problems, which modern institutions profit from manipulating collective emotion. When we study the Colosseum, we are studying ourselves. This is uncomfortable. We prefer to treat history as something remote and separate. We want to believe that the brutality of ancient Rome is alien to us, that we've progressed beyond such things, that we're fundamentally different from people who watched others die for entertainment. But the evidence suggests something more complicated. Humans appear to contain similar capacities regardless of time period. The same capacity for cruelty, the same attraction to spectacle, the same willingness to rationalize participation in systems of exploitation. The Romans justified the Colosseum by framing it as justice, entertainment, tradition, necessity. We justify modern spectacles using similar language. They're legal, they're consensual, they're voluntary, they're traditional, they're necessary for economic reasons. The justifications evolve, but the underlying logic remains. Participation in exploitation can be rationalized if the framing is right. Does this mean moral progress is impossible? That we're condemned to repeat Rome's patterns endlessly? The evidence suggests otherwise. Rome eventually transformed its relationship to gladiatorial combat. Societies do gradually shift moral frameworks. Practices that were once acceptable become abhorrent. This happens slowly. It requires multiple pressures. But it happens. What might constitute genuine moral evolution? Perhaps simply the capacity to recognize patterns, to see the Colosseum in modern systems and consciously choose differently, to understand that what feels inevitable might actually be chosen. That spectacle systems persist not because they're essential, but because they serve powerful interests. That alternatives are possible even if we haven't yet built them effectively. The deeper question is whether recognition itself changes anything. Studying the Colosseum creates consciousness. But does consciousness translate to action? Does understanding how spectacle works make us less susceptible to it? Or does knowledge function primarily as intellectual exercise, satisfying our curiosity while leaving systems fundamentally unchanged? History provides mixed evidence. Some people encounter brutal histories and become activists for change. Others encounter the same histories and treat them as interesting stories. Knowledge doesn't automatically generate different choices, but lack of knowledge makes different choices nearly impossible. Awareness, though insufficient by itself, remains necessary. The Colosseum functions as mirror because what we see when we look at it reflects our own values and consciousness. When medieval people saw it, they saw curse and danger. When Renaissance people saw it, they saw achievement and art. When modern people see it, we might see tragedy or tourism or warning or symbol. All these interpretations are valid. But the fact that we must interpret that we have choices about what meaning we assign suggests that we also have choices about what systems we create and participate in. Standing before the Colosseum, you confront questions about yourself. What attracts you to this place? What do you feel? What does that feeling tell you about your own relationship to spectacle and violence? These aren't comfortable questions, but they're the ones the ruins insist on raising. The silence of the empty arena asks, if we recognize the pattern, what will we do with that recognition? If we understand how spectacle operates, will we operate differently? If we can see Rome in ourselves, will we choose to be different from Rome? The Colosseum doesn't provide answers, it provides mirrors. What you see in those mirrors depends on who you are and what you're willing to acknowledge. But standing before ancient stone, confronting the reality of how humans have organized violence and suffering into spectacle, you cannot entirely escape the question, what are we building? And what are we willing to rationalize? Spartacus is the name everyone knows. The slave who rebelled. The man who organized hundreds of other enslaved fighters and led them in armed uprising against Rome itself. His story became legendary. It persisted through history. It was written about, celebrated, turned into literature and film. Spartacus transcended his historical moment and became symbol. But Spartacus is not unique because his life was unique. Spartacus is famous because his story was preserved and retold. Other fighters' names survived too. Flamma, whose fighting record was so exceptional that he was offered retirement multiple times and refused, choosing to continue fighting until he died. Spiculus, whose skill was so breathtaking that the emperor himself attended games specifically to watch him. Priscus and Verus, whose legendary duel was so perfectly balanced that both fighters were granted their lives. These names appear in historical records. We know fragments of their stories. But what do we actually know? What can we reconstruct from the fragments? Flamma's record shows he fought at least 34 times and survived most encounters. This tells us something. Either he was extraordinarily skilled, or the system protected him because he was famous and valuable. Probably both. His repeated survival meant he accumulated wealth and status. Enslaved individuals who became famous fighters sometimes achieved remarkable economic positions. They could own property. They had followers and admirers. They had a kind of power, though always conditional on their continued ability to fight. The accounts of specific battles involving famous fighters are preserved in historical sources, but how reliable are these accounts? We don't know. They might be historically accurate. They might be mythologized, they might be partially true. The problem is that we have no way to verify them against other sources. We're working with fragments, papyrus documents, inscriptions on stone, graffiti. All of these preserve some information, but they preserve it incompletely and selectively. What's most striking is how certain fighters became legendary, while others vanished entirely. Why did some names survive? Partly because they were famous enough that their names were written down by people whose writing survived. Partly because their stories were dramatic enough to be retold. Partly because they challenged the system in visible ways. Spartacus's rebellion ensured his name would be remembered precisely because he threatened Rome's power. But most fighters didn't challenge anything. Most lived and died without generating narratives compelling enough to preserve. The biographical details we have for famous fighters reveal complexity, relationships, families, economic lives. Spiculus apparently had a romantic relationship with an emperor, suggesting that even enslaved fighters navigated social hierarchies in sophisticated ways. Some fighters married, some had children, some accumulated property and respect. They weren't simply disposable, at least not the famous ones. They had lives that extended beyond the arena. They had relationships and investments and futures to consider. What happened to fighters who retired? We have scattered evidence of men who survived their fighting careers and lived into old age. This suggests that not all fighters died young, that a skilled fighter who survived long enough to retire might live a relatively normal lifespan afterward. But what was life like for a retired fighter? Was it economic comfort? Or was it isolation and obsolescence, being remembered as what they'd been but no longer valuable for what they currently were? The relationships between fighters and lannistas, between lannistas and emperors, between emperors and crowds, these relationships shaped individual fighter experiences. A fighter owned by a lannista, who was wealthy and connected to an emperor, might have different odds than a fighter owned by a smaller lannista. Status mattered, connections mattered. Being part of a network of power gave you protection that being isolated didn't provide. But most fighters were isolated. Most had minimal connections to centers of power. Most were expendable. Yet each of these forgotten men was a person, a consciousness, someone with experiences and fears and hopes. The fact that we don't know their names doesn't mean they didn't matter. It means we've lost access to who they were. But somewhere in Roman records, fragments of their existence remain. Inscriptions, burial markers, bones in mass graves, physical evidence of lives lived. For every Flamma or Spartacus or Spiculus, there were hundreds of fighters whose names were never recorded, who lived and died and were forgotten. Archaeology and science are now providing tools to reconstruct fragments of who these people might have been. Skeletal remains tell stories if you know how to read them. A bone that has healed from a fracture indicates previous injury. Multiple healed fractures indicate a fighter who survived multiple encounters. The pattern of healed injuries can suggest career length and probability of survival. Some remains show evidence of dozens of previous injuries, suggesting careers spanning years or decades. Other remains show catastrophic injuries with no healing, suggesting death came quickly. The physical evidence creates a picture of different trajectories and different odds. Isotopic analysis of bones reveals what people ate. Gladiators' diets were distinctive, high in certain minerals intended to build bone strength in particular ways. This distinctive diet signature in bones allows archaeologists to identify gladiators in burial sites, to understand where they fit in the social hierarchy, to see if they were treated differently than other enslaved people, or if they were integrated into normal labor populations. The chemical composition of bones tells a story of deliberate conditioning. DNA analysis reveals origins, where fighters came from, what populations they represented. This provides evidence of how systematic recruitment was across the empire. Fighters came from conquered territories, from regions that Rome had control over. The genetic patterns show the actual composition of the arena population in ways historical records never specified. We can now see that the arena population was more diverse, more far-flung, more systematically recruited than some earlier historians suggested. Medical interventions visible on bones tell another story. Evidence of surgery, evidence of setting broken bones correctly, evidence of sophisticated wound treatment. Some fighters received excellent medical care. Others received minimal care. This differential treatment suggests status differences, even among fighters. Famous fighters got better medical attention, received treatment designed to keep them alive for future fights. Nameless fighters might be patched up well enough to fight again, or might be left to die if the injuries were severe. The bones preserve evidence of these different treatment protocols. What did daily life actually feel like? We can reconstruct probable routines based on historical sources and architectural evidence. Training in morning heat. Specific exercises designed to condition particular muscle groups. Eating specialized diets. Living in close quarters with other fighters, knowing that any day might bring death. The psychological reality of that existence is harder to access, but we can imagine, based on what we understand about human psychology and trauma responses, fear would be constant. Hypervigilance would be constant. The knowledge that life was uncertain and could end suddenly would shape consciousness in specific ways. Evidence of resistance exists fragmentarily. Some remains show signs that might suggest suicide injuries inflicted by oneself rather than opponents. Some historical accounts mention fighters who resisted or attempted escape. The system was designed to be inescapable, but the fact that some attempted escape anyway suggests that suffering and desperation sometimes overcame conditioning. Religious practice appears in the evidence. Inscriptions suggesting Christian faith. References to gods. Prayer marks on stones. Some fighters appear to have found spiritual meaning or comfort in their circumstances. Others might have engaged in magical thinking or superstitious practices seeking any possible advantage. The way people in traumatic situations construct meaning varies, but the need to construct meaning appears universal. The families of fighters remain mostly invisible. Were women fighters often accompanied by family? Did certain families specialize in gladiatorial fighting, passing down knowledge and technique? Did fighters have children who were raised around the ludus? We have fragments suggesting that some fighters maintained family connections, but the broader picture remains obscure. Most records focus on the individual fighters and ignore the entire ecosystem of families and relationships surrounding them. What emerges from these fragments is not a single narrative, but multiple possible narratives. Different fighters experience the system differently, depending on their skill, their status, their connections, their luck, their psychology. Some thrived within constraints, some endured, some broke, some found ways to create meaning. What unites them is that all of them were human beings, navigating impossible circumstances. That recognition, grounded in physical evidence and archaeological reconstruction, honors their existence even when we cannot know their names. Thousands died in the Colosseum. Thousands more died in other arenas throughout the empire. Tens of thousands across centuries. Does it matter now? Should it matter? These are harder questions than they initially appear. From one perspective, it's history. It's finished. Those people are dead. Nothing we do now changes what happened then. The suffering they experienced cannot be retroactively redeemed or justified by present-day recognition. They endured and died and were largely forgotten. That's simply what happened. Moving forward seems more useful than dwelling on past suffering we cannot change. From another perspective, witnessing matters, bearing testimony matters, refusing to forget matters. The fact that these people lived and suffered and died doesn't disappear because we stop talking about it. But our willingness to acknowledge it, to honor it, to refuse to sanitize it, that matters in ways that might not be immediately practical, but that shape culture and consciousness. History isn't just the past. It's the relationship we maintain with the past through memory and meaning-making. The question of accountability is complicated. Should we hold Rome's elite responsible for the spectacle? In what sense? They're dead. But the principles of responsibility that might apply to them apply to us. If Rome's elite were responsible for systems of exploitation, are we responsible for ours? If the answer is yes, what does that responsibility entail? If the answer is no, on what grounds can we make that distinction? The decline of gladiatorial combat might represent moral progress. Societies do become more ethical over time. Practices that were once acceptable become abhorrent. This suggests that moral evolution is possible, but it might simply represent economic and political change. Resources became scarce, different ideologies gained power, the system became less useful. Change happened for practical reasons rather than moral reasons. Whether that distinction matters depends on what you believe about how change actually occurs. What does learning this history obligate us to do? Perhaps nothing specific. Perhaps it obligates us to think more carefully about the spectacles we participate in, to ask whether they require exploitation, to consider the human cost of entertainment we consume, to recognize patterns of spectacle and control in our own systems. Perhaps it obligates us to resist participation in systems we recognize as harmful. Or perhaps knowledge itself is sufficient awareness without action. Different ethical frameworks produce different conclusions. A consequentialist approach focuses on outcomes. Did the Colosseum produce net suffering or net benefit? The suffering was real and immense. The benefits were distributed to those in power and those entertained by spectacle. Most frameworks would probably conclude that the suffering outweighed the benefits. But even that conclusion doesn't necessarily lead to clear action about what we should do now. A deontological approach focuses on principles. Was the Colosseum wrong regardless of its consequences? Many would argue yes. The violation of human dignity, the treatment of human beings as mere resources, the deliberate infliction of suffering, these are wrong in principle. But again, that principle-based conclusion doesn't necessarily lead to clear guidance about what we should do with this knowledge. What's certain is that the Colosseum raises questions that don't have final answers. Questions about how societies organize violence, about why we're drawn to spectacle, about how we justify exploitation, about whether we can do better, about what we owe to those who suffered in the past and those who suffer in systems we participate in now. The moral accounting isn't something we complete and close. It's something we remain engaged with. The questions are urgent. They matter now because they shape what systems we build and what systems we accept. Standing before the evidence of past suffering, we're invited to make different choices, not because it will change the past, but because how we respond to the past shapes what future we create. We've explored the Colosseum extensively. We've examined its architecture and its psychology. We've investigated the lives of fighters and the systems that controlled them. We've traced its influence forward through history. And yet, enormous gaps remain. Fundamental questions persist. The deeper you look, the more you realize how much we don't know. How much has been lost or deliberately suppressed, or simply never recorded in the first place. What are the exact death rates? We don't know with precision. We have estimates. We have fragments of evidence, but comprehensive statistics covering centuries of games across the entire empire? That data doesn't exist. Or if it existed, it's been lost. We can construct educated guesses based on the evidence we have. We can see patterns, but exact numbers remain inaccessible. And without exact numbers, certain claims about the spectacle remain uncertain. What about predetermined outcomes? Were fights orchestrated? Did certain matchups have predetermined winners? The evidence is ambiguous. Some accounts suggest predetermined outcomes. Others describe genuine uncertainty. The truth probably lies somewhere in between, varying by context and time period. But we cannot know precisely how often fights were genuine competition and how often they were theater. This uncertainty affects how we interpret the entire system. If most fights were predetermined, the spectacle was fundamentally different from what we imagine. If most were genuinely uncertain, the system operated differently. What happened to specific famous fighters? Certain legendary accounts exist, but are they historically accurate? Did Spartacus's rebellion actually happen as described? Were certain famous champions mythologized beyond recognition? We have no way to verify against other sources. We're working with fragments. Some might be historically reliable. Others might be largely fiction. The boundary between history and legend has eroded over centuries. Why are certain periods of the games well documented while others are obscure? We have detailed accounts from some eras and almost no information from others. Is this simply because some records survived while others were lost to time, or were certain records deliberately suppressed? We might never know. Libraries burned, documents decayed. Many records were simply never made. The gaps in our knowledge might reflect gaps in what was originally recorded, rather than gaps in what was deliberately preserved. Ongoing archaeological projects continue to reveal new information. New technologies are being applied to old evidence. CT scanning reveals details invisible to earlier archaeologists. DNA analysis reveals information that earlier methods couldn't access. Three-dimensional modeling allows us to reconstruct structures and experiences. Each new technological advancement illuminates previously dark corners. Our understanding continues to evolve. What we think we know today might be revised tomorrow. Yet, some questions may be fundamentally unanswerable. What was it like to be a fighter waiting in darkness beneath the arena? What specific thoughts went through a person's mind in their final moments? What did the roar of 50,000 people feel like to someone in genuine mortal danger? These experiential questions are inaccessible. The people who could have answered them are dead. Their subjective experiences are gone. We can imagine based on what we understand about human psychology and neurology. But direct knowledge is impossible. What does this incompleteness mean? Does it invalidate what we do know? Should we treat all our knowledge about the Colosseum as provisional, subject to revision? Probably yes to both. But incompleteness doesn't mean irrelevance. The fact that we can't know everything doesn't mean what we do know doesn't matter. The gaps in our knowledge are themselves informative. They tell us where our understanding is limited. They invite humility. They suggest that certainty is inappropriate, that wisdom involves acknowledging what cannot be known, while still taking seriously what can be known. The mysteries persist, and perhaps they should. Perhaps complete knowledge would diminish the Colosseum's power. The mystery is part of what makes it compelling. The questions that cannot be answered, the gaps that cannot be closed, the silence that won't reveal all its secrets. These absences maintain the arena's capacity to speak to us across nearly 2,000 years. The Colosseum is not finished. It is not a complete historical artifact frozen in time. It continues to exist. It continues to change. It continues to be interpreted and reinterpreted. What it means shifts with who encounters it and what they bring to that encounter. Physically, the structure is being preserved and restored. Decisions are made constantly about what to preserve and what to allow to decay. Which sections to stabilize, which to reconstruct. What does it mean to rebuild part of a structure associated with suffering? These aren't merely technical questions. They're philosophical. They're moral. They affect how future generations will encounter this history. In educational contexts, the Colosseum functions as teaching tool. Students learn about it. But what do they learn? What narratives are prioritized? Is it presented as engineering triumph? As evidence of human cruelty? As historical artifact without moral dimension? The choices educators make shape how the next generation understands Rome and understands human nature. Different educators make different choices. A single structure can carry multiple narratives simultaneously. Digital technology is creating virtual reconstructions, three-dimensional models showing the Colosseum as it might have looked when fully intact. Interactive experiences allowing people to walk through digital versions. These reconstructions can deepen understanding. They can help people grasp the scale and complexity, but they can also create false certainty. They can suggest that we know exactly what it looked like, when in fact we're making educated guesses translated into digital form. Virtual reconstruction is itself interpretation. It presents specific choices as if they were certain historical facts. Different cultures interpret the Colosseum differently. For some, it represents the glory of ancient Rome. For others, it represents cruelty and exploitation. For some, it's primarily a tourist attraction. For others, it's a sacred site connected to Christian martyrs. These different interpretations coexist. They're all valid. But they're also in tension. What does it mean to honor both the engineering achievement and the human suffering? How do we acknowledge both dimensions? Ongoing research continues to reveal new information. Archaeologists find artifacts. Scientists develop new analysis methods. Understanding continues to evolve. New questions emerge. What seemed settled is sometimes revisited. What seemed mysterious is sometimes clarified. The Colosseum remains an active site of historical investigation. Its story is not finished being told. The future of the Colosseum is uncertain and contested. Should sections be fully reconstructed to show what it originally looked like? Or should the ruins remain partially broken, preserving the visible evidence of decay and time? Should access be expanded so more people can encounter it? Or should preservation requirements limit access? Should it be treated primarily as archaeological site, or as tourist destination, or as sacred space? Or as all of these simultaneously? Some propose rebuilding the arena floor so that the full original structure becomes visible. Others argue that the exposed hypogeum provides unique insight that reconstruction would cover up. The debates reflect deeper questions about what the Colosseum is for, what purpose it should serve, how we should relate to it. There's no obvious answer. Different purposes require different approaches. Different communities have different stakes. What seems certain is that the Colosseum will continue to mean different things to different people, that its significance will continue to evolve, that future generations will encounter it and construct new interpretations. The Colosseum is not finished. Its story continues. Its meaning continues to shift. It remains alive in the sense that matters most, as ongoing site of human meaning-making and engagement. We've journeyed through the Colosseum together. We've descended beneath the sand. We've encountered the fighters and the crowds and the systems that connected them. We've traced influence forward and backward through time. We've acknowledged what we know and what remains mystery. Now we must ask the hardest questions. What does it mean that we've encountered this history? How should understanding shape us? The Colosseum represents a paradox. It's evidence of extraordinary human achievement. The engineering was sophisticated, the organization was complex. The architecture remains impressive even in ruins. Romans created something that lasted 2,000 years. But simultaneously, the Colosseum represents extraordinary human cruelty. Thousands died there. Suffering was industrialized. The spectacle was intentional. Rome constructed a system deliberately designed to exploit and consume human life. This paradox isn't unique to Rome. Throughout history, civilizations have combined remarkable achievement with remarkable cruelty. Great art and philosophy emerged alongside slavery. Magnificent architecture coexisted with brutal warfare. The same societies capable of extraordinary beauty were capable of extraordinary violence. Rome is no exception. It's simply an unusually clear and well-documented example of this pattern. Should we judge Rome by its own standards, or by contemporary moral standards? This question has no simple answer. Judging by Rome's standards makes certain practices seem normal, makes the spectacle seem justified, makes it harder to recognize the cruelty. But judging by contemporary standards risks anachronism, risks imposing modern values onto a different context. Most nuanced approach probably acknowledges both. Rome operated within its own context, but that context included choices. Rome could have organized itself differently. The fact that spectacle became central was a choice, not an inevitability. Does understanding the Colosseum change how we relate to contemporary spectacle? Probably. It makes us more aware, more conscious. It allows us to recognize patterns, to ask whether modern entertainment and media operate on similar principles, to consider whether we're participating in systems we'd condemn if they were ancient. But awareness alone may not be sufficient. Understanding how spectacle works doesn't automatically make us immune to it. Knowing the mechanisms doesn't prevent our engagement. What would it mean to actively resist spectacle logic? To seek entertainment that doesn't depend on distraction or manipulation? To participate in culture that doesn't require consumption of others' suffering? This is difficult. Spectacle-based entertainment is everywhere. It's normalized. It's profitable. Resistance requires conscious choice, effort, constant questioning of what we're willing to participate in. Most people don't sustain this resistance. We slip back into consuming spectacle because it's easier, because it's available, because the alternative is less accessible. Yet the possibility remains. Different choices are possible. Different systems can be imagined. Different ways of creating community and meaning and entertainment that don't depend on exploitation. These alternatives exist fragmentarily. Participatory theatre, community art, collaborative activities, but they remain marginal. They don't generate the engagement or profit that spectacle-based entertainment does. Scaling alternatives would require economic and cultural transformation. What the Colosseum teaches is that human systems are not inevitable, that what seems normal is often chosen. That exploitation can be dressed in the language of entertainment and justice and tradition. That consciousness and ethics matter, that we're responsible for the systems we create and participate in, that future generations will look back at what we built and will judge us by what we were willing to accept. The Colosseum asks each of us directly, what are you willing to accept? What spectacles do you participate in? What suffering do you consume as entertainment? What systems have you rationalized as necessary or normal? Given what you now understand about how these systems operate, what will you choose differently? These aren't rhetorical questions. They're real questions deserving real consideration. The Colosseum stands as evidence that humans are capable of building systems of extraordinary cruelty. But it also stands as evidence that those systems can eventually end, that consciousness can shift, that different futures are possible. What future we build depends on the choices we make, on what we're willing to accept, on who we choose to become. The story of the Colosseum is not finished. It continues in the choices we make, in the systems we build, in what we're willing to witness and question and resist. The arena is empty now, silent. But the questions it raises echo across time, demanding engagement, demanding consciousness, demanding that we recognize ourselves in this history and live differently because of that recognition.